The gravel road, long neglected, gnashed beneath my tires, each stone a small, sharp protest against my intrusion. The forest, ancient and sullen, pressed in on either side, its skeletal branches clawing at the overcast sky. For a cartographer, precise lines and predictable contours were the bedrock of my world, but here, in this remote corner of my inherited past, the landscape felt deliberately unmapped, a place where the wilderness had swallowed intent whole. The estate emerged from the gloom like a shipwreck, a hulking silhouette against the bruised horizon. My great-aunt's passing, delivered by a terse letter from a distant solicitor, had bequeathed me this crumbling legacy, Blackwood Manor. It was a name that tasted of mildew and forgotten stories, a counterpoint to the clean, sterile light of my drafting table. I had always preferred the clarity of historical data, the verifiable truth etched onto parchment, to the murky depths of ancestral memory. Yet, here I was, drawn by an obligation as old and weighty as the house itself. The wrought iron gates, rusted into a permanent snarl, groaned open with a sound like a tortured breath. As I drove through, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or forgotten iron. The manor itself was a testament to time's relentless erosion. Gables slumped, windows stared out like blind eyes, and ivy, a verdant shroud, wrestled with the stone, slowly reclaiming the edifice for the forest. Stepping from the car, I was met by an absolute silence, profound and unsettling. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My footsteps crunched on the gravel, disturbingly loud in the stillness. I ran a hand over the rough stone of the manor's facade, feeling the chill seep into my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was not merely a house, it was a mausoleum of forgotten moments. Each breath felt heavy, as if I were inhaling the very history of the place. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing vast, high-ceilinged rooms shrouded in white sheets, like ghosts awaiting their resurrection. The furniture beneath them was shapeless, silent. I moved with a cartographer's methodical pace, my eyes scanning, assessing, trying to impose order on the chaos of abandonment. My exploration led me to a grand, if severely dilapidated, central staircase. It was a peculiar design, this stairwell that loops back to the same landing, a serpentine path that doubled back on itself, offering glimpses of the floor below and the floor above in an Escher-like convolution. Each turn felt less like progress and more like a deliberate disorientation, a subtle trick of perspective designed to confuse. I felt a faint dizziness, a fleeting sense that the house was playing with my perception, already chipping away at my ordered world. Finally, I found what I sought, a library, or what remained of one. Shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded, their pages exhaling the acrid scent of mildew and forgotten knowledge. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, tiny, frantic spirits in the vast quiet. I began my search with the same methodical precision I applied to my maps, sifting through stacks of yellowed correspondence, brittle ledgers, and arcane journals. It was tucked away, not in a prominent place, but in a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the back of a large oak desk. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch required for ancient documents, found the small, almost imperceptible seam. Inside, wrapped in a square of heavy, water-stained canvas, was a wooden box, unadorned and surprisingly light. Within, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay the map. My breath hitched. My professional eye, trained to discern authenticity and detail, instantly recognized its age. The parchment was thick, hand-rendered, its edges softened by centuries. The inks, faded but still vibrant in places, depicted the estate, its fields, its forest, and the winding river that bordered it. It was exquisitely detailed, a masterwork of its time, showing every contour, every stand of ancient oak, every minor tributary with an almost obsessive precision. But it was incomplete. Large sections, particularly around the manor itself and extending into the deeper woods, were left blank, save for faint, pencil-thin outlines of what seemed to be unknown structures or features, sketched in an almost spectral hand. And then there were the symbols. Not the familiar cartographic symbols of churches or mills, but something older, arcane, etched with a deliberate, unsettling purpose. Geometric patterns I couldn't place, lines that seemed to form eyes, or mouths, or something even less definable, appeared at various points, particularly where the map faded into its unsettling blankness. This was not merely an unfinished map, it was a deliberate omission, a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. The precision of the known portions only highlighted the terrifying emptiness of the unknown. What did this map imply? What secrets did it refuse to fully disclose, and why? And the map, clutched in my hands, was the first unsettling step. The estate's heavy oak door, thick with the grime of decades, yielded with a groan that seemed to echo from the very bones of the house. I stepped across the threshold, my boots scuffing against dust motes dancing in the meager light filtering through grimy panes. The air inside was a stagnant breath, cold and tasting of damp stone and forgotten wood. My cartographer's tools, carefully packed, felt like a flimsy shield against the oppressive silence that instantly swallowed the crunch of the gravel outside. I laid out the inherited map on a vast, cobweb-draped table in what must have once been a drawing room. Its vellum, brittle with age, cracked softly as I unrolled it. The ink, a rich sepia, depicted the estate with an unnerving precision, yet it was a precision I already knew to be anachronistic. This was not a modern survey. This was something far older, a testament to a landscape that had shifted, or perhaps, been deliberately altered. My fingers traced the intricate lines of the property boundaries, the stylized rendering of the manor house itself, and the delicate crosshatching of the surrounding woodlands. But it was the blank spaces, the areas left incomplete, that drew my gaze like a magnetic north. My initial exploration began within the decaying edifice. Each room was a tableau of arrested time, shrouded furniture like sleeping giants, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or rusted iron, that teased at the edges of my perception. I carried a modern survey, a precise digital rendering of the current property, and began the meticulous process of reconciliation. From a high window overlooking the south grounds, I noted the sprawling, untamed gardens that the ancient map depicted as meticulously ordered parterres. The discrepancies were immediate, stark. A small, circular stone fountain shown on the vellum was now a choked pit of brambles and moss, almost swallowed by the earth. But more unsettling was the absence of what should be there, and the presence of what shouldn't. The old map hinted at pathways through the dense forest to the west, paths that simply weren't visible on the contemporary surveys, nor evident in the overgrown wilderness that stretched before me. I resolved to explore the grounds in person, the map clutched in my hand like a sacred text. Stepping outside, the cold air, though crisp, carried an undertone of decay, a whisper of autumn that felt prematurely aged. I walked the perimeter of the manor house, comparing the elegant, etched lines of the map to the crumbling reality. Here, a section of wall was depicted as solid stone, but in truth, it was a precarious stack of loose masonry, ready to collapse with a breath. Venturing further, into the wilder parts of the estate, the land grew increasingly difficult to navigate. The trees here were Ancient, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers, and beneath them, the light struggled to penetrate. I found myself drawn to areas of the map marked only with a single, cryptic symbol, a stylized spiral. It was as if the very light was being absorbed, not merely blocked, by some unseen force. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and damp earth as I pushed through thickets of hawthorn and ivy. It was then I began to find them, oddly placed stone markers. Not boundary stones, for they bore no property lines, nor garden ornaments, for they were rough-hewn and devoid of embellishment. They were scattered seemingly at random, half buried in the soil, their surfaces eroded by centuries of weather. Yet, they seemed to align in an almost imperceptible pattern, forming an imprecise, sprawling geometry that defied any logical purpose. One such marker, half submerged in a tangle of roots, had a shallow, circular depression carved into its top, too smooth to be natural erosion, too precise to be accidental. It was a detail unrecorded on either map. Returning to the house as dusk began to gather, the internal discrepancies of the estate seemed to intensify. I sought the upper floors, hoping for a better vantage point, but found myself disoriented by the winding corridors. I descended a short flight of steps, the wood creaking under my weight, and then another. I turned a corner, expecting to find the main hall, but instead, I was met by the sight of the very steps I had just descended. I frowned, my cartographer's mind, accustomed to linear progression, struggling to reconcile the impossible. I took the steps again, deliberately, counting each riser, each landing. 3 flights down, a sharp left, and then I was back at the top of the first flight, staring down into the same dim passage. A low, resonant hum, like a distant, vibrating string, seemed to emanate from the very walls, a sound too deep to be natural, too subtle to be easily dismissed. My meticulous mind, so reliant on the predictable, felt a profound tremor of unease. The estate was not merely old, it was actively, subtly, defying its own form. My initial days were a blur of methodical unpacking and exploration. I found a serviceable study, its walls lined with empty shelves, and a bedroom on the second floor with a sturdy, if dusty, 4-poster bed. The house was vast, a labyrinth of dim passages and echoing chambers, each one holding a layer of undisturbed dust like a shroud. I began to sense the estate not as an inert structure, but as a colossal, slumbering beast, slowly stirring. A rustle of old drapery, the wind sighing through ill-fitting window frames, the groan of timbers settling. My cartographer's mind, trained in precision and logic, catalogued them as natural phenomena. Yet, they seemed to coalesce, not dissipate, lingering at the edge of hearing, like a half-forgotten name. But the frequency of these fleeting blurs, always just beyond direct sight, began to prickle at my composure. One evening, I laid out my inherited map on the large, scarred table in the study. It was a beautiful, unsettling thing, hand-drawn with an obsessive intricacy that mirrored my own. I had left my compass and a particular set of fine-tipped pens precisely arranged at the map's top edge. When I returned after fetching a glass of water, the compass lay several inches to the left, and the pens, though still grouped, were angled differently. A small shift, easily attributed to my own absent-mindedness or an unnoticed bump of the table. I corrected their placement, a faint unease stirring in my gut. The next morning, a heavy tome I'd been consulting, a local history detailing the estate's early land grants, had slid from the desk's edge to the floor. I distinctly remembered closing it and leaving it centered. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, my rationalizations feeling thinner now, like worn paper. This pattern repeated. A stack of papers I had squared away would be askew. A chair I had pushed neatly under the table would be pulled out a few inches. Each instance was minor, negligible on its own, but their cumulative effect began to gnaw at the edges of my meticulous order. I spent hours poring over the map, comparing its faded lines to modern surveys I'd brought. The estate's history, as revealed in its boundaries and features, was a story of gradual encroachment, of secrets held close. One afternoon, as the low sun slanted through the grimy study window, illuminating the map with an almost spectral glow, I noticed it. A series of faint, almost imperceptible lines near the estate's northern boundary, not present before. I leaned closer, my magnifying glass pressed against the aged parchment. Was it the light? A trick of my own straining eyes? I ran a finger over the spot. The paper felt subtly different there, a raised texture I hadn't noticed before, as if the ink had been applied, or revealed, from within the very fibers of the map. That night, sleep was a fractured thing. I saw not images, but felt sensations, the crush of soil, the pressure of stone, an immense, unblinking presence deep beneath the earth. They spoke no words I understood, but their cadence was a dirge, a lament, and a demand. I woke with a gasp, the metallic tang of the house's air suddenly sharpened my nostrils, my skin clammy with sweat. The looping design was disorienting, each turn bringing me back to what felt like the same spot, yet deeper. I felt a profound sense of entrapment, as if the house itself were playing a cruel game. I froze, my breath catching. It wasn't a trick of light, not this time. My meticulous, rational mind, which had always been my anchor, began to fray. The house was not merely old, it was alive, and it knew I was here. My boots scuffed against carpets that had long since surrendered their patterns to grime, each step raising a faint, dry whisper. The house felt not empty, but merely dormant, awaiting my awakening presence. My cartographer's instinct, usually a compass for the tangible world, now pulled me deeper into this spectral geography. I moved through a cavernous drawing room, its furniture draped in ghostly sheets, their forms hinting at grand, forgotten shapes beneath. My objective was clear, the study, rumored to contain the family archives. I found it eventually, down a long corridor where the wallpaper peeled like sunburned skin, revealing layers of faded floral patterns beneath. The study was a tomb of knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and titles obscured by age. A massive oak desk, scarred and ink-stained, dominated the center, buried beneath stacks of papers, ledgers, and what appeared to be personal effects. The air here was even thicker, laced with the sharp tang of decaying paper and the faint, metallic scent of old iron, perhaps from the forgotten inkwells. I began my excavation. Hours blurred into a singular, focused pursuit. My fingers, usually tracing precise lines on maps, now sifted through brittle parchment and faded script. The dust, fine and ubiquitous, coated my hands, my clothes, settled into the lines of my face. It felt less like dirt and more like the pulverized remains of time itself. First, the journals. The earliest entries, penned in a graceful, looping hand, spoke of the estate's early days, of bountiful harvests and tranquil evenings. But then, a shift. The script became more erratic, the tone agitated. A great-great-grandparent, I deduced, had begun to record peculiar disturbances. The sound of weeping from empty rooms. A constant, low thrum felt beneath the floorboards, an unseen pulse. It watches. It waits. The final pages were smudged, illegible, ending abruptly with a frantic, desperate scrawl. Next, the letters. Correspondence between various generations of my family and local figures: a solicitor, a parish elder, a distant cousin. A recurring theme emerged: the unsettling nature of the estate, the peculiar melancholia that seemed to afflict its occupants. One letter, dated roughly a century prior, spoke of a previous owner who had begun to draw strange, intricate symbols on the walls of his room. Convinced that the house itself was speaking to him, instructing him to complete the pattern. This individual had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the cryptic artwork and a lingering odor of damp earth in his chamber. My cartographers, I was drawn to specific geographical references, and they corresponded, with terrifying precision, to the blank spaces and enigmatic symbols on my own incomplete map. The map wasn't just a survey, it was a guide, an invitation, perhaps even a key. I ascended, expecting to find a new floor, only to find myself back where I began, facing the same dusty portrait of a stern-faced ancestor. The wood creaked under my weight, each groan a complaint from the house's ancient bones, but the feeling of being trapped, of being observed, was more unnerving than the spatial paradox itself. I returned to the study, my mind a churning vortex of dates, names, and increasingly unsettling connections. The research revealed a grim tapestry, a pattern of madness, disappearances, and strange occurrences, all woven into the fabric of the land and, more specifically, the points of interest on my map. The folklore I unearthed, scribbled in the margins of an old almanac, spoke of an ancient pact, of a force buried deep beneath the earth, demanding sustenance. It wasn't a curse, it was something far more primal, a deep-seated hunger. The map. It wasn't just incomplete, it was deliberately incomplete. The cryptic symbols weren't decorative, they were instructions. The map was not merely a representation of the estate, but a blueprint for its malevolence, a key to unlocking something ancient and terrible. I had sought to complete a map, to bring order to disarray. Instead, I had stumbled upon a terrifying invitation. And the house, I now knew, was listening. The air inside had clung to me, a shroud woven from dust and the decay of generations, long after I'd retreated from the deepest chambers. It was a chill that seeped into the marrow, not the bite of winter, but something ancient, a cold born of absence. Even as I ascended the familiar steps, the scent of forgotten lives and crumbling plaster seemed to have imprinted itself upon my clothes, a phantom weight. Dust motes, once dancing innocently in meager light, now seemed to swirl with purpose, like tiny, ethereal scouts caught in the perpetual twilight of this ancestral edifice, watching me. But the unsettling quiet of the following days was not quiet at all. It was a pressure, a vast, unseen presence that hummed just beneath the threshold of hearing, like a distant, forgotten engine. My peripheral vision, once a reliable sentinel, began to betray me. A flicker in the hallway mirror, not my reflection, but something taller, elongated, a shadow within a shadow, gone the instant I turned my head. The heavy velvet curtains in the drawing room seemed to ripple even when no breeze stirred the ancient glass, suggesting a form pressed against them, yearning to break free. At first, they were merely a rustle, the sound of parchment brushing against itself, or the wind sighing through a cracked pane. Then, they sharpened, coalescing into indistinct murmurs, like a hushed conversation just beyond a closed door. I would pause, straining, convinced I heard my name. One afternoon, hunched over the sprawling map on the dining table, tracing a newly discovered fault line in the estate's bedrock, a heavy book of local folklore slid from a shelf in the adjacent study. I stared, my breath catching, at the empty space it had occupied. There was no tremor in the floorboards, no open window, no plausible explanation. My hand, poised over the map, trembled slightly. This was active. I needed to speak to someone. To hear a voice untainted by the house's pervasive gloom. When he answered, his voice was bright, full of the everyday concerns I was rapidly forgetting. "Overwrought," he said, a note of polite concern, quickly followed by a hint of dismissal. "Are you sure you're not just, well, letting the isolation get to you? These old places can play on the mind." He suggested a break, a visit to the city, a change of scenery. He didn't believe me. Not really. That evening, a bone-deep weariness settled upon me, a fatigue that sleep could not touch. Its existence had always puzzled me, a redundant architectural flourish, a spiral that led nowhere new. As I ascended the first few steps, a faint light glimmered at the top of the loop, a pale, sickly green. My heart, which I had convinced myself was merely tired, began to beat with a frantic urgency against my ribs. It was not the moon, nor any lamp I had lit. And then, a shape began to resolve itself within that unnatural glow, tall, gaunt, indistinct, like a figure sculpted from smoke and regret. It seemed to watch me, its presence a pressure against my eyes, though no features were discernible. "You are ours. The blood calls." I stumbled back, my foot missing a step, sending a jarring pain through my ankle. The apparition did not move, did not speak, but its silent gaze, I felt it, followed my every panicked breath. The green light pulsed, briefly illuminating what I thought was an arm, long and skeletal, reaching, not for me, but for something unseen just behind it. I fled, not knowing where to go, only away from that looping stairwell, away from the impossible figure. My attempts to rationalize, to explain away the impossible, had shattered. The house was not just old, it was alive, and it wanted something from me. My isolation was absolute. The outside world had no ears for such horrors, and the estate itself had become a living, breathing maw, slowly, methodically, consuming me whole. And the map, the accursed map, lay open on the dining table, a silent witness, its incomplete lines now seeming to pulse with a malevolent, knowing gleam. The shock of the apparition, skeletal and silent, still thrummed through my bones. My ankle, twisted on the missed step, burned with a dull, throbbing ache, a physical tether to the nightmare I had just endured. I scrambled backward, not caring where my limbs landed, only that they carried me away from that looming, green-lit terror. Its silent gaze, I felt it, followed my every panicked breath, a weight on my soul. I didn't wait for it to reach, to speak, to move. I pushed off the wall, ignoring the searing protest from my ankle, and stumbled blindly down the remaining steps, each thudding impact vibrating up my spine. I didn't stop until I burst into the relative familiarity of the main hall, gasping, leaning against the heavy oak doorframe of the study. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, echoing the frantic rhythm of the house itself, a house that felt suddenly, violently alive. The memory of the apparition was a phantom limb, an ache that wouldn't dissipate. The study, with its familiar scent of aged paper and leather, offered no true solace. I poured a measure of amber liquid into a glass, my fingers fumbling, and swallowed it quickly. The burn was a welcome distraction, momentarily dulling the edge of my fear. But even as my body screamed for rest, my mind, a cartographer's mind, demanded answers. The map, sprawled across my large drafting table, seemed to hum with an unspoken secret. My earlier, more mundane interpretations now felt laughable, pathetic. This wasn't a treasure hunt. This was something else entirely. I returned to the map, my eyes scanning the strange symbols I had meticulously copied from the forgotten texts I'd found tucked away in a hidden compartment of my ancestors' desk. They were not coordinates, not markers for geographical features. My gaze fell upon a series of intricate, almost microscopic etchings along the map's periphery, previously dismissed as decorative flourishes. But now, with the memory of the green light and the skeletal arms searing my mind, I saw them for what they truly were, a cipher, a key. They were a commentary, an instruction set, perhaps even a warning, scribed in a hand so ancient it made the very paper feel fragile. I leaned closer, my breath clouding the aged parchment. My injured ankle throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the growing horror in my mind. I cross-referenced, deciphered, and translated, my fingers tracing the lines, my mind struggling to accept the terrible truth slowly unfolding. The map was not a guide to a hidden cache of gold. It was a diagram of containment. The lines, the contours, the strange, radiating patterns, they denoted not subterranean passages or water veins, but a complex, interlocking series of wards. A prison. And at its very heart, where the most unsettling, non-Euclidean symbols clustered, lay the revelation, a depiction of something vast, formless, and ancient beyond any human reckoning. It was buried deep beneath this land, beneath my land. Not a treasure, but a burden. The text, once translated, spoke of a primal evil, a malevolent consciousness slumbering, held in abeyance by these very wards, these seals. They were symptoms. The seals were weakening. The ancient prison was failing. The map, my ancestors' legacy, was not an invitation to discovery but a terrible inheritance. And then, the final, crushing blow, hidden within a particularly obscure passage, a reference to the bloodline, to the chosen keeper, to the one who hears the call. I wasn't just an heir. I was summoned. Drawn here, not by chance, but by a malevolent current running through my own lineage. Was I meant to reinforce the fading seals, to somehow complete the work of my ancestors and contain this ancient, slumbering horror? Or was I, through my unwitting interference, merely hastening its release? The thought was a physical blow. The choice, if it was a choice at all, was too vast, too monstrous to comprehend. My hands, still trembling, fell away from the map. The gas lamp flickered, and in the sudden, brief dimness, I thought I heard a faint, guttural rumble from deep within the earth beneath my feet. It was not a sound of slumber, but of stirring. I wasn't just an heir. I was summoned. Drawn here, not by chance, but by a malevolent current running through my own blood. Was I meant to reinforce the fading seals, to somehow complete the work of my ancestors, or was I merely a fresh conduit, a vessel for an ancient hunger? The air itself seemed to thicken with this revelation, pressing against my skin like damp wool. Every shadow held a deeper hue, every creak of the ancient timbers a more deliberate groan. The estate, once a puzzle to be solved, was now a predator, and I, its unwitting prey. The compass needle quivered incessantly, no longer pointing north, but spiraling in a frantic dance, a reflection of the disquiet within me. A low hum began to permeate the stone, a vibration felt more in my bones than heard by my ears. It resonated with the pulse of the earth beneath, a deep thrumming that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the estate, from the depths where the map's cryptic lines led. It was a song, I realized, a wordless, guttural melody that spoke of unfathomable age and boundless patience. And it was calling to me. The hum pulsed stronger, a rhythmic invitation. It was an architectural anomaly, a spiral of aged oak steps that ascended for a short flight, only to turn sharply and descend, depositing me back onto the very landing from which I had started. A bewildering, pointless loop designed, perhaps, to disorient, to trap. The entity's presence here was suffocating, a weight on my chest that made each breath a conscious effort. The air in the stairwell was thick with a palpable energy, a dense, swirling current that tugged at my clothes, at my hair. Descend, the thought pressed, not into the stairwell's impossible loop, but through it, beyond its illusory design. I saw it then, not with my eyes, but with a terrifying clarity in my mind, a faint seam in the stone wall at the base of the looping stairwell, hidden by years of grime and cunning masonry. My fingers, trembling, traced the outline. It was not a natural fissure, but a door, meticulously concealed. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed. The stone groaned, a sound like a forgotten beast stirring from a long slumber. A section of the wall receded inward, then slid sideways with a grating shriek, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the very soles of my boots. Within the passage, not far from the opening, a small, lead-bound volume lay upon a rough-hewn stone shelf. Its cover was etched with symbols I recognized from the periphery of my map, symbols I had dismissed as mere decorative flourishes. Now, they glowed with a faint, internal luminescence. This was the reveal/discovery. I snatched the book, my hands clammy. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with a spidery script, ancient and arcane. My eyes, trained to decipher old cartographic notations, struggled, yet a terrible understanding began to seep into me, not through reading, but through direct impression, as if the words themselves bypassed my intellect and resonated directly with the ancestral current within me. It spoke of the binding, a ritual performed by my forebears to contain the thing that stirred beneath the estate. It spoke of seals, not of stone and mortar, but of blood and will, of a profound sacrifice required to maintain the stasis. My recent efforts with the map, my methodical delving into its secrets, had not merely threatened its prison, they had awakened it fully, drawn its attention to the new bloodline, to me. The text was explicit. The countermeasure was to renew the binding, but the cost. The cost was monumental. It required not just a symbolic offering, but a piece of myself, something core to my being, to be willingly given to reinforce the seals. The ritual demanded a profound act of self-erasure, a surrender of memory, of identity, of the very essence that made me read. The hum intensified, morphing into a guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the ground beneath. The entity was demanding its due, demanding its freedom, or demanding its renewal through my ultimate sacrifice. The stakes were terrifyingly clear, fail, and the ancient hunger would consume not just this estate, not just this lineage, but spill forth, an unstoppable tide of unmaking. Succeed, and I would become a ghost in my own mind, a cartographer without a map of his own life. The spidery script blurred beneath my gaze, yet the meaning, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, had already pierced the fragile membrane of my understanding. It wasn't a language to be read, but a truth to be absorbed, a terrible, ancient pact etched not in ink, but in the very marrow of this land, this lineage. The book had not merely provided instructions, it had opened a conduit directly into the entity's gnawing hunger, showing me the inevitable path, the required offering. My hands, still clutching the brittle tome, trembled not with fear, but with a horrifying clarity. I, Reed, was the final link, the inheritor of a debt that demanded payment in the deepest, most forgotten chamber beneath my ancestral home. A shiver, not of cold but of profound defilement, traced its way down my spine. The ritual. The sacrifice. The air in the study, once merely dusty, now seemed to press in, thick with the scent of loam and something metallic, something that spoke of ancient blood in damp stone. My breath hitched. There was no turning back. The entity, a presence I could now feel as a constant, icy pressure behind my eyes, would not allow it. My gaze swept the room, seeking some anchor, some familiar comfort. There was none. I needed a light, a tool. A small, blunted trowel, usually for garden work, felt heavy and significant in my other hand. It was not for digging, I knew, but for something far more precise, far more gruesome. Stepping out of the study, the house groaned around me, a symphony of settling timbers and shifting foundations that now sounded like a living complaint. I gripped the lantern, its single, fragile flame a defiant beacon against the encroaching gloom. It showed the true heart of the estate, not the manor house or the sprawling grounds, but the veins and arteries beneath, culminating in a single, pulsating core. The entrance, I knew, was hidden within the oldest part of the cellar, behind a wall I had always dismissed as solid bedrock. Descending the familiar cellar steps, the air grew heavy, tasting of earth and forgotten things. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to originate from the very core of the earth, yet was somehow amplified within my own skull. It was the entity, impatient, hungry. My hands, guided by an instinct that was no longer entirely my own, traced the faint outline of a hidden doorway. With a desperate heave, I pushed. The stone groaned, grinding against unseen hinges, and slowly, reluctantly, swung inward, revealing a maw of absolute blackness. A stench, thick and cloying, billowed out, a mix of stagnant water, decaying vegetation, and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust mixed with dried blood. My stomach churned, but I pushed down the nausea. This was it. The final descent. The walls were not carved stone, but raw earth, shored up by timbers that looked centuries old, slick with moisture and fungal growth. It was a cruel trick, a mockery of a path. Turn back, read. You are lost. My mind reeled. Had I imagined it? Had I simply walked in a circle? No. The entity was playing with me, twisting the very fabric of space to deter my progress. I closed my eyes, pressing my palms against the rough, cold stone of the wall, trying to ground myself. It's too late. You're already broken. Give up. Join us. I opened my eyes, determined. I would not be fooled. This was a test, a gauntlet. I focused on the faint, metallic tang in the air, the one that promised the chamber below. This time, I placed my left hand firmly on the wall, dragging it along the rough surface, a physical anchor against the mental assault. I smelled something foul, like carrion, then something sweet and cloying, like lilies on a funeral pyre. My senses were under siege. The hum, which had faded in the looping stairwell, now returned, stronger, vibrating through the soles of my boots, up my legs, into my very bones. It was a song of ancient power, of vast, unspeakable hunger. Ahead, the passage widened, opening into a vast, echoing space. The air here was thick, heavy with the metallic scent, but also with something else, something ancient and powerful, like ozone after a lightning strike, but infinitely more sinister. My lantern, its flame now flickering weakly, barely pierced the gloom of the cavernous chamber. I was at the precipice. The entity's presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle my knees, to shatter my resolve. But I had come too far. The terrible understanding, the knowledge of what awaited me, what I had to do, burned with an icy fire in my gut. I raised the lantern, its light trembling, revealing the first monstrous outlines of the chamber's true horror. I was here. I was ready. Or as ready as a man could be, standing on the threshold of his own damnation. I opened my eyes, determined. This was a test, a gauntlet. I would not succumb to the entity's games. This time, I placed my left hand firmly on the wall, my fingers splayed against the cold, damp stone. I pushed forward, one deliberate step at a time, my hand a constant guide. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs like a shroud of wet earth, each breath a shallow, hard-won victory. Whispers slithered from the abyssal dark, not words, but the echo of forgotten anguish, the rasp of generations succumbing to a slow, gnawing despair. I felt the familiar twist in the geometry, the dizzying sensation of space folding in on itself, threatening to unravel my very sense of direction. But I knew its trick now. My mind, a compass honed by countless forgotten maps, found the subtle deviation. A tremor in the very fabric of the estate that the entity, for all its ancient power, could not entirely mask. It was a flaw in its illusion, a tiny fracture in its dominion, and it was all I needed. I pressed on, my focus absolute, my will a sharpened blade against the entity's insidious assault. Visions flickered at the periphery of my sight, my own reflection, haggard and ancient, staring back from the polished stone, then melting into a stranger's face, a visage contorted by silent agony. But the metallic tang, faint as it was, persisted, a bitter, constant tether to the truth. It was the scent of the earth's deep wounds, the mineral breath of the chamber below. My hand found a rougher patch of stone, then a sudden, unexpected gap. I stepped into the chamber, a space I had glimpsed in fragments, in the map's unsettling lacunae. At its center, a raised plinth of rough-hewn stone dominated the space, its surface etched with symbols I now recognized from the margins of my ancestors' frantic sketches, not letters, but directional markers, lines of force, a complex, forgotten geometry. Its presence was a scream without sound, a hunger without end, an ancient malevolence coiled in waiting. My hands trembled, but my mind was a steel trap. I unfolded the incomplete map, the final fragment I had meticulously drawn, the piece that completed the pattern. It wasn't just a representation, it was a key, a binding. My ancestor hadn't merely mapped the estate, he had mapped its prison. The missing lines, the blank spaces, they weren't omissions, they were gaps in the warding, places where the entity's influence could seep through, where its hunger could reach. My task was to complete the ward, to close the breaches, to seal the ancient wound. I laid the finished map onto the plinth, aligning the final, crucial lines with the etched symbols. The symbols on the stone began to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light, mirroring the intricate lines on my map. The metallic tang intensified, becoming a bitter taste in my mouth, the taste of rust and old iron, of blood long dried. The entity recoiled, not physically, but as a sudden, sharp intake of pressure, a gasp of pure malevolence that ripped through the air. The entity was showing me their failures, their sacrifices, their madness. It wanted me to break, to falter, to abandon the ritual, to join their ranks in its eternal consumption. But I held fast. I focused on the lines, the precise angles, the intersections. My cartographer's mind, so long a tool for understanding the physical world, was now a conduit for sealing the metaphysical. I traced the final, intricate lines on the map with my finger, pressing down, willing the pattern to solidify, to become. Each stroke was an act of will, a defiance against the ancient hunger, a silent scream of my own against the entity's dominion. As I completed the last line, a low, resonant thrum vibrated through the stone, through my bones, through the very air. The glowing symbols on the plinth flared, then dimmed, coalescing into a single, impenetrable seal. The suffocating pressure lifted, replaced by a profound, agonizing emptiness. I had done it. I had contained it, but the cost. My vision blurred. My hands, still resting on the sealed map, felt ancient, withered, as if they had aged a century in that single, terrible moment. It wasn't just the entity that had been locked away, a part of me had gone with it. The vibrancy of the world seemed muted, the colors duller, the sounds distant, muffled by a shroud I now carried within. I felt the thrill of discovery, the meticulous joy of mapping, the very essence of my passion, seemed to have been siphoned away, leaving only the sterile echoes of a completed task. I was whole, yet terribly, irrevocably broken. The estate was safe, perhaps. But I was not. My left hand, raw and scraped, found purchase on the cold, unforgiving stone. Not the slick, illusory warmth I had been offered, nor the phantom grip that promised an easy descent into oblivion. This was true stone, coarse and dusted, and it shuddered faintly beneath my touch, a dying echo of some immense, recent violence. My eyes, crusted with grit and dried tears, slowly peeled open, refusing the insistent press of darkness. I was still here. I had not followed the lure. The metallic tang I had sought was now a suffocating cloud, thick with the scent of pulverized rock and something else. Something ancient and acrid, like burnt bone and ozone. It clotted my throat, stinging my lungs with every shallow breath. I lay slumped, half-sprawled against the wall, my limbs unwilling to obey. A dull, throbbing ache resonated through my entire frame, a symphony of bruises and sprains. My head swam, the world tilting and righting itself with a sickening lurch, but the deep, resonant presence that had filled every atom of the estate was gone. Utterly, irrevocably gone. I pushed, a groan tearing from my throat, and managed to shift my weight, my back grinding against the rough masonry. Debris lay scattered on the steps, shards of pottery, fragments of plaster, the skeletal remains of what might have been a small, intricately carved table. My gaze drifted down to my left hand, the one I had placed on the wall. This was new. This was the cost. I tried to rise, my legs trembling, refusing to bear my weight. I fell back against the wall, a choked cry escaping me. Every muscle screamed in protest. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer exhaustion of my body, pushed beyond all limits. The entity was gone, yes, but it had taken something with it, and left something else in its place. Attuned. My senses seemed sharper, the metallic tang of the air more nuanced, the subtle currents of cold air more distinct. I felt the tremors in the earth beneath the foundation, the slow, grinding shift of settling stone, as if the estate itself was sighing in its ruin. With excruciating effort, I dragged myself upright, using the shattered banister for support. My reflection, caught in a sliver of ornate mirror still clinging precariously to the wall, showed a stranger. My face was gaunt, streaked with grime and dried blood, my eyes wide and sunken, pupils dilated. But it was not just the exhaustion. There was a new intensity in them, a brittle, knowing glint that had not been there before. The man in the mirror had seen something, confronted something, and survived, but the survival had carved a new map onto his very being. I limped, one agonizing step at a time, along the ruined landing. The grand hall below was a panorama of devastation. A gaping hole had torn through the ceiling, exposing the skeletal ribs of the roof above, open to the indifferent sky. Rain, or perhaps dew, had pooled on the floorboards, reflecting the gray light like shards of broken glass. Furniture lay overturned, shattered. The tapestries, once rich with woven history, hung in tatters, like weeping flags of surrender. The air carried the pervasive scent of damp rot and exposed earth, the smell of a wound left open to the elements. The estate, my ancestral home, was a ruin. No one outside would ever know. No one would understand the sheer, soul-rending horror I had faced, the price of the entity's departure. The silence was absolute, but the tension remained, a tight coil in my gut, a chilling whisper that told me some scars never truly healed. This was true stone, coarse and dusted, and it shuddered faintly beneath my touch, a dying echo of some insidious whisper, retreating into the earth's deep memory. Each muscle in my body screamed, a choir of protest against the climb, but the instinct for the living air, for the sight of the sky, was a desperate, unyielding current. I did not know how long I scrambled, a blind creature emerging from a burrow, but eventually, my fingers brushed against the rough mortar of the upper passages. A sliver of gray light, thin as a ghost's sigh, pierced the gloom. I dragged myself onto the familiar, if dust-laden, floor of the estate's lower levels, gasping lungfuls of air that tasted of damp earth and forgotten things. My body mended, the lacerations on my hands fading into white scars, but the deeper wounds festered unseen. I walked through the familiar rooms of the estate, a phantom in my own home. The sun, when it streamed through the tall windows, felt alien, too bright, too indifferent. My drafting table, still littered with half-finished charts, awaited me. I picked up a fine-tipped pen, its weight suddenly foreign, its purpose obscure. My fingers trembled. The elegant curves of a river, the jagged peaks of a mountain range, they no longer held the same simple beauty. I saw not just the land, but the imprisonment of the land, the layers of soil and rock holding down an eager, patient hunger. My precision had been a shield, a way to order the chaotic world. Now, the world was ordered, but the order was one of containment, and I was its reluctant keeper. The estate itself had changed. The cellar, the forgotten passages, the very ground beneath the oldest stones. I would stand for hours, just listening, feeling the subtle vibrations that resonated through the floorboards, a low thrumming that was both a warning and a constant reminder. And then there was the stairwell that loops back to the same landing. It had been the path of my descent, the spiraling maw that promised an endless return. Now, it stood, a silent sentinel. It no longer felt actively malevolent, but rather, profoundly sealed. The way back down was still there, but the allure, the terrifying pull, had been replaced by a quiet, watchful presence. It was as if the entity, having been denied its full feast, had retreated, but not vanished. It had merely settled, deeper, more patient, knowing it had left its mark. The estate was not just my inheritance, it was my burden. My victory had been a partial one, a containing rather than a conquering. I had paid a price, not in blood, but in tethering. My life, once free-ranging and intellectual, was now bound to this decaying land, to the knowledge of what lay beneath, restless and waiting. The terrifying sacrifice had been my peace, my detachment, my future. I would rise, a compulsion urging me towards the old map, the one that had started it all. I would trace its incomplete lines, my fingers lingering on the blank spaces, feeling the subtle pulse beneath the parchment. I was no longer just a cartographer, I was a guardian, a sentinel. The horror was contained, yes, but it hummed beneath my feet, a constant, low vibration in the bedrock of my very being.